You know, there is something rather extraordinary that happens when a person begins to truly awaken. Not the awakening that comes from reading books or attending lectures, mind you, but the kind that emerges from the depths of one's own being, like water rising from an underground spring. It is a quiet revolution that occurs in the soul, invisible to the outer world, yet profound enough to change everything about how one sees and moves through life. I have spent many years observing this phenomenon, both in my patients and within myself, and I have come to understand something that may surprise you. The spiritually awakened individual, the one who has glimpsed the deeper currents that move beneath the surface of ordinary consciousness, faces a peculiar kind of danger. Not physical danger, you understand, but something far more subtle and potentially devastating. The danger of revelation. What I mean by this is quite simple, yet the implications are vast. When you begin to see through the veils that most people accept without question, when you start to perceive the unconscious patterns that drive human behavior, when you recognize the shadow elements that individuals and entire societies refuse to acknowledge, you possess a kind of knowledge that others are not ready to receive. And here lies the paradox that every awakening soul must navigate. The very insights that have freed you from illusion can become chains that bind you to isolation if you are not careful about how and when you share them. The wisdom that has brought you clarity can create confusion and hostility in others if offered at the wrong moment or in the wrong way. This is why I want to speak with you today about 5 particular aspects of your spiritual awakening that you must guard carefully, not out of selfishness or superiority, but out of genuine wisdom and compassion. The first thing you must never casually reveal is your ability to see through the personas that people wear. You see, every human being constructs what I call a persona, a mask they present to the world. This mask is not necessarily false, it is simply incomplete. It shows only what the individual believes is acceptable, admirable, or safe to display. But when you awaken spiritually, you begin to develop what might be called psychological X-ray vision. You start to see not just the mask, but the person beneath it, with all their fears, their hidden motivations, their unacknowledged desires. This capacity is both a gift and a burden, because once you possess it, you cannot unsee what you see. You will notice the ambitious colleague who presents himself as humble and selfless. You will perceive the friend who claims to be happy but carries deep wells of sadness. You will recognize the family member who speaks of love while acting from wounded pride. And the temptation will be enormous to point out these discrepancies, to help people see themselves more clearly, to tear away the veils of self-deception. But here is what I have learned through many years of careful observation. People are not ready to abandon their personas until they have developed something genuine to replace them with. The mask serves a purpose. It protects a fragile inner self that may not yet have the strength to face the world directly. When you point out the gap between someone's persona and their authentic self, you are not offering them freedom. You are threatening the very structure that allows them to function in the world. I once knew a man who had developed remarkable insight into human nature. He could see through pretense as clearly as you might see through glass. And he made the mistake of believing that his perceptions were gifts he should share freely. At dinner parties, he would gently point out the contradictions he observed. In conversations with friends, he would offer what he thought were helpful insights into their unconscious patterns. He believed he was being kind, you see, helping people toward greater self-awareness. What happened instead was devastating. People began to avoid him. They felt exposed and uncomfortable in his presence. They could not maintain their necessary illusions when he was around, and rather than thanking him for his clarity, they resented him for it. He found himself increasingly isolated, not because he was cruel or judgmental, but because he had not learned the wisdom of timing and discretion. The spiritually awakened person must understand that consciousness cannot be forced upon others. It must be invited, welcomed, chosen. And most people are not ready to make that choice until they have experienced sufficient pain or confusion in their current way of being. Your role is not to accelerate this process, but to be available when they naturally begin to question their own masks. This brings us to the second thing you must guard carefully, which is your perception of the collective shadow. Every group, every family, every organization, every nation has what I call a shadow, those aspects of itself that it cannot or will not acknowledge. These are the qualities that the group projects onto others, the characteristics they condemn in their enemies while remaining blind to them in themselves. When you awaken spiritually, you begin to see these shadow projections with startling clarity. You notice how a family that prides itself on being loving actually operates through subtle manipulation and control. You observe how a religious community that speaks of compassion excludes and judges those who think differently. You recognize how a nation that considers itself peaceful maintains its security through violence that it simply chooses not to see. This awareness can be profoundly disturbing because you realize that most human conflict, most suffering, most cruelty arises not from conscious evil, but from unconscious shadow projection. People genuinely believe they are fighting against darkness while acting it out themselves. They sincerely think they are defending goodness while perpetrating the very things they claim to oppose. The temptation here is to become a prophet of truth, to point out these shadow dynamics wherever you encounter them. You may feel called to show people how their hatred of others is really hatred of themselves, how their fear of external threats masks their terror of their own inner darkness, how their righteous anger is often nothing more than projected shame. But again, this is a revelation that must be guarded with great care because shadow projection serves a psychological function. It allows people to maintain a positive self-image by placing all their negative qualities outside themselves. To remove this mechanism without providing something healthier to replace it with is to risk psychological collapse or explosive rage. I remember sitting in a gathering where someone with genuine spiritual insight began pointing out the shadow dynamics at play in a community dispute. Everything they said was accurate. The observations were brilliant and potentially healing. But the timing was wrong. The approach was too direct, and the result was chaos. People became defensive, accusations flew, relationships were damaged, and the very healing that might have occurred was prevented by premature revelation. The awakened person learns to work with shadow indirectly, through example rather than exposition. You embody a different way of being rather than explaining why others are wrong. You demonstrate integration rather than pointing out projection. You become a living question that others may eventually ask themselves rather than forcing them to confront answers they are not ready to receive. The third thing you must never carelessly reveal is your direct experience of the numinous, those moments when you have touched something beyond ordinary consciousness, when you have felt the presence of what I call the self with a capital S, when you have encountered what religious traditions call the divine, but which transcends all particular religious formulations. These experiences are perhaps the most precious gifts of spiritual awakening. They are moments when the boundaries of the ego dissolve, and you experience yourself as part of something infinitely larger and more meaningful. They may come as profound dreams, as synchronicities that seem impossible to dismiss as coincidence, as sudden insights that transform your entire understanding of reality, or as direct mystical experiences that leave you forever changed. The problem is that these experiences are so vivid and transformative for the person who has them that it seems natural to want to share them, to help others understand what you have discovered. But here is what I have observed repeatedly. When you attempt to communicate numinous experiences directly, they almost always lose their power and meaning in translation. What was profound and life-changing for you becomes mere words to others. What felt like ultimate truth to you sounds like fantasy or delusion to them. What transformed your entire worldview strikes them as interesting at best, nonsensical at worst. And worse than simply being misunderstood, your sacred experiences may be ridiculed, analyzed away, or dismissed as psychological symptoms. I learned this lesson painfully in my own life. There were experiences I had, visions and insights that came to me with such clarity and force that I felt compelled to share them with colleagues and friends. I discovered that even those who were sympathetic often tried to reduce these experiences to something more manageable, to fit them into existing psychological or religious categories rather than allowing them to remain mysterious and transformative. The numinous experience loses its power when it becomes a story you tell others rather than a living reality that continues to transform you. The moment you try to prove your spiritual experiences to someone else, you have already begun to lose connection with them yourself. They become concepts rather than living truths, memories rather than ongoing revelations. This does not mean you must never speak of these experiences, but rather that you must choose your moments and your listeners with extraordinary care. The person who is ready to hear about numinous experience will ask the right questions, will approach with reverence rather than skepticism, will recognize the sacred nature of what you are sharing, rather than trying to explain it away. Most people, when they first encounter someone who has had genuine numinous experiences, will do one of two things. They will either dismiss what you are saying as imagination or mental aberration, or they will become hungry for such experiences themselves, pestering you for techniques and methods as if the sacred could be acquired like a skill at trade school. Both responses miss the point entirely. The numinous cannot be summoned on demand, nor can it be explained away by rational analysis. It comes when the soul is ready, when the conditions are precisely right, when the ego has been sufficiently humbled or expanded to allow something greater to enter. And it leaves just as mysteriously, often when we are grasping too tightly for its return. I have watched people become obsessed with recreating peak experiences, chasing after the numinous like addicts, seeking their next fix. They lose sight of the fact that these experiences are not meant to be possessed, but to possess us, not to be controlled, but to transform us. The moment you begin treating the sacred as a commodity to be acquired or a story to be told, you have already stepped outside the very consciousness that makes such experiences possible. The fourth thing you must guard with utmost care is your understanding of what I have come to call the collective unconscious, that vast reservoir of shared human experience that lies beneath individual consciousness. When you awaken spiritually, you begin to sense that you are not simply an isolated individual struggling alone through life, but rather a temporary expression of something much larger and older than yourself. You start to perceive the archetypal patterns that repeat themselves across cultures and centuries. You recognize the eternal dramas being played out in your own life and in the lives of everyone around you. You see how the same fundamental conflicts, the same essential journeys, the same deep structures of meaning appear again and again in different forms, but with identical substance. This recognition can be extraordinarily liberating, because it means your personal struggles are not merely personal. Your suffering has meaning because it connects you to the suffering of all humanity. Your search for truth echoes the search that every conscious person has undertaken since the dawn of awareness. Your individuation process, your journey toward wholeness, follows pathways that have been walked by countless souls before you. But here lies a profound danger. When you begin to see these archetypal patterns operating in other people's lives, when you recognize that someone is living out the eternal drama of, say, the poor Eternus, the eternal child who refuses to grow up, or the Senex, the wise old man who has become rigid and controlling, or the anima projection that causes a man to fall in love with his own unconscious feminine nature reflected in a woman, the temptation becomes almost irresistible to share these insights. You see your friend trapped in a mother complex, unable to separate from the devouring aspects of the maternal archetype, and you want to help them understand what is happening. You observe your colleague living out the shadow of the hero's journey, trying to save everyone around them while avoiding their own inner work, and you feel compelled to point out this pattern. You recognize your family member caught in the grip of the animus, possessed by rigid opinions and harsh judgments, and you believe that naming this possession might free them from it. But what I have learned, sometimes through painful experience, is that archetypal knowledge is not meant to be used as a tool for analyzing others. When you tell someone they are caught in a complex or possessed by an archetype, you are essentially telling them that their most intimate experiences, their deepest emotions, their core sense of identity is nothing more than an impersonal pattern, a cosmic cliché that has been repeated millions of times throughout history. Even if this is true, even if your perception is accurate, this knowledge rarely liberates the person you are trying to help. Instead, it often makes them feel diminished, reduced, explained away. They may become defensive about their uniqueness, or they may become fatalistic about their ability to change, believing themselves to be mere puppets dancing to archetypal strings. I once made the mistake of explaining to a patient that his romantic obsessions were classic anima projections, that he was falling in love not with actual women, but with his own unconscious feminine nature that he was seeing reflected in them. Everything I said was psychologically accurate. The pattern was clear. The dynamics were textbook examples of what I had observed in dozens of other cases. But my explanation, rather than freeing him, seemed to drain all the meaning and passion from his experiences. He began to doubt not just his romantic feelings, but his capacity for genuine emotion at all. If his love was merely projection, if his deepest feelings were nothing more than archetypal patterns, then what was real about him? What was uniquely his own? I had given him knowledge, but I had inadvertently taken away his sense of personal meaning and individual significance. This taught me that archetypal understanding must ripen within a person naturally. They must discover these patterns for themselves through their own experience and reflection. When someone is ready to see the archetypal dimensions of their life, they will ask the right questions, they will be drawn to the right books and teachers, they will begin to recognize the patterns without being told what to look for. Your role as someone who has awakened to these deeper structures is not to be a teacher or interpreter for others, but to live these understandings so completely that your very presence becomes a question that others may eventually ask themselves. You become someone who has clearly done their own inner work, who has wrestled with their own complexes and made peace with their own archetypal inheritance. And this becomes an invitation for others to begin their own journey. The fifth and perhaps most crucial thing you must never casually reveal is the full extent of your disillusionment with ordinary social reality. When you awaken spiritually, when you begin to see through the collective fantasies and shared delusions that most people take for absolute truth, you experience what can only be described as a kind of cosmic loneliness. You realize that much of what people spend their lives pursuing, wealth, status, social approval, even many forms of love and relationship, are based on unconscious agreements to maintain certain illusions. You see how much energy is wasted on activities that have no real substance, how much suffering is created by people chasing after things that cannot ultimately satisfy them, how much of human life is spent in what amounts to elaborate games of pretense and distraction. This seeing can be devastating because it means you can no longer participate wholeheartedly in many of the activities and conversations that occupy most people's time. You cannot get excited about accumulating possessions you know will never bring lasting satisfaction. You cannot invest deeply in social hierarchies you recognize as arbitrary constructions. You cannot take seriously many of the dramas and conflicts that others consider supremely important. But if you reveal the full extent of this disillusionment too openly, if you let people see how little their concerns actually concern you, how transparent their motivations appear to you, how meaningless many of their pursuits seem from your perspective, you will not enlighten them. You will threaten them at the deepest level because you are essentially calling into question the entire framework within which they have constructed their sense of meaning and purpose. I learned this lesson through watching my own relationships change as my understanding deepened. There were friendships that could not survive my growing inability to participate in certain kinds of conversations, professional relationships that became strained when I could no longer pretend to care about things I had seen through completely, family dynamics that shifted uncomfortably when I stopped playing roles I had outgrown. The challenge is to maintain compassion for those who have not yet seen what you have seen, to remember that their illusions serve important psychological functions, that their unconsciousness protects them from truths they are not yet ready to bear. Your disillusionment with social reality must be balanced by a deep understanding of why these illusions exist and what purpose they serve in the overall economy of the human psyche. This does not mean you must pretend to believe what you no longer believe or participate in activities that feel meaningless to you. But it does mean you must find ways to honor the genuine needs that these illusions are attempting to meet, even if you can no longer meet those needs through the same means others use. You become like someone who has learned a foreign language while living among people who speak only their native tongue. You understand what they are really saying beneath their words. You recognize the deeper currents moving through their conversations. But you must be extraordinarily careful about how much of your understanding you reveal, because too much translation too quickly can create more confusion than clarity. The awakened person learns to live simultaneously in two worlds: the world of ordinary social reality with its necessary illusions and agreed upon meanings, and the world of deeper truth with its sometimes harsh but ultimately liberating insights. You develop what might be called a double consciousness, able to function effectively in conventional society while maintaining your connection to transcendent understanding. This is not hypocrisy, it is wisdom. It is the recognition that consciousness develops gradually, that people must be met where they are rather than where you think they should be, that your role is not to destroy others' illusions, but to embody an alternative that they may eventually choose to explore for themselves. The most dangerous revelation of all, however, is your growing awareness of the profound loneliness that accompanies genuine awakening. You see, there is a terrible irony in spiritual development. The more conscious you become, the more you realize how unconscious most people remain. The more you connect with universal truths, the more isolated you become from ordinary human community. The deeper your understanding grows, the fewer people there are who can truly comprehend what you have discovered. This isolation is not born of arrogance or superiority. It is simply the natural consequence of seeing what others cannot yet see, of experiencing what others have not yet experienced, of carrying knowledge that others are not ready to receive. You find yourself living in an increasingly different world from those around you, even when you occupy the same physical spaces. I have observed this phenomenon countless times in my practice. The patient who has made significant progress in their inner work often reports feeling more alone than they did when they were suffering, but still part of the collective unconsciousness. They speak of feeling like strangers in their own families, outsiders in their own social circles, foreigners in their own culture. This loneliness cuts deeper than ordinary social isolation because it touches the very core of what it means to be human. We are social creatures designed to find meaning through connection with others. When your consciousness develops beyond the level of those around you, when your understanding encompasses truths that others actively resist, you face a choice that every awakening soul must eventually confront. Do you retreat back into comfortable unconsciousness to regain belonging, or do you accept the loneliness that comes with staying true to what you have seen? But here is what you must never reveal to others: the full depth of this isolation. If you speak openly about how alone you feel despite being surrounded by people, if you express the profound sadness that comes from being unable to share your deepest insights with those closest to you, if you admit how difficult it is to maintain relationships when you can see so clearly what others cannot, you will be met with incomprehension at best, hostility at worst. People will tell you that you are being dramatic, that you are choosing to be isolated, that you simply need to try harder to connect. They will suggest that your spiritual insights have made you cold or superior or self-absorbed. They cannot understand that the loneliness you experience is not a failure of character, but a natural consequence of consciousness development. I remember sitting in my study one evening, overwhelmed by this particular kind of solitude. I had spent the day with colleagues, patients, friends, engaging in conversations that touched only the surface of what I knew to be true about human nature and the depths of the psyche. I was surrounded by intelligent, well-meaning people, yet I felt as though I were speaking a language no one could understand, living in a reality no one else could perceive. In that moment, I understood something that I had read about in the mystical traditions but had never fully grasped. The spiritual path is inherently a path of solitude, not because the awakened person withdraws from others, but because consciousness itself is fundamentally a solitary experience. No one can see through your eyes, feel through your heart, understand through your mind. The deeper your inner work goes, the more you realize that each soul must ultimately walk its own path, alone. This realization can be devastating if you reveal it too quickly or to the wrong people. Those who have not yet experienced this level of inner development will either dismiss your feelings as self-pity or become frightened that spiritual growth leads inevitably to isolation and despair. Neither response serves anyone's highest good. The truth is more nuanced and ultimately more hopeful than it initially appears. Yes, there is a kind of loneliness that accompanies awakening. But there is also a different kind of connection that becomes possible, a communion with life itself that transcends the need for constant human validation and understanding. You begin to find companionship in nature, in silence, in the depths of your own being. You discover that you are never truly alone because you carry within yourself the eternal patterns, the archetypal energies, the collective wisdom of all humanity. Moreover, you begin to attract others who have walked similar paths, souls who have also paid the price of consciousness and understand the territory you now inhabit. These connections, when they occur, are deeper and more meaningful than anything you experienced in your unconscious state. They are based not on shared illusions or mutual projections, but on genuine recognition of the divine spark that exists within each awakened being. But perhaps the most profound realization is that your loneliness serves a purpose in the greater economy of human consciousness. You are like a scout who has ventured ahead of the main group, exploring territory that others will eventually need to cross. Your isolation is not meaningless suffering, but a kind of service, a preparation of the way for those who will follow. You must learn to carry this loneliness with dignity, neither flaunting it as a badge of spiritual superiority, nor hiding from it in desperate attempts to reconnect with levels of consciousness you have outgrown. It becomes a sacred solitude, a space in which deeper truths can emerge, a silence in which the voice of the self can finally be heard above the noise of collective unconsciousness. I have found that those who can bear this loneliness without bitterness, who can accept the isolation that comes with genuine insight without becoming cynical or withdrawn, often develop a quality of presence that is profoundly healing to others. They become like lighthouses, standing alone on rocky shores, but offering guidance to ships navigating treacherous waters in the dark. This brings us to a final consideration about what must be guarded in your spiritual awakening. You must never reveal the full extent of your compassion for human unconsciousness. When you truly see how much suffering is created by ignorance, how much pain comes from people's inability to understand themselves, how much damage is done by those who are completely unaware of their own shadow projections and unconscious motivations, your heart breaks open with a kind of universal compassion that is almost unbearable. You begin to see every cruel act as an expression of inner woundedness, every harsh word as a cry for help, every act of unconsciousness as a tragic waste of human potential. This understanding brings with it a love for humanity that is so vast and so painful that it threatens to overwhelm your capacity to function in ordinary life. But if you reveal the full depth of this compassion, if you show others how completely you understand and forgive their unconscious behaviors, you create a different kind of problem. Some people will take advantage of your understanding, using your compassion as permission to avoid taking responsibility for their actions. Others will feel diminished by your forgiveness, as if your understanding somehow reduces the significance of their struggles and choices. The awakened person must learn to hold their compassion like a sacred fire, warming those who are ready to receive its heat, but not forcing its light on those who prefer to remain in darkness. Your understanding of human unconsciousness must be balanced by respect for the journey that each soul must take, including the journey through ignorance and suffering that often precedes genuine awakening. You become like a physician who has seen every form of human illness but does not walk through the world diagnosing everyone you meet. Your knowledge serves you in knowing how to help when help is truly wanted and needed, but it does not compel you to offer treatment to those who have not asked for it. This wisdom of containment, of knowing what to reveal and what to guard, what to share, and what to keep sacred becomes one of the most crucial skills of spiritual maturity. It is the difference between wisdom and mere knowledge, between genuine service and unconscious interference, between love that liberates and love that suffocates. The spiritually awakened person learns to live with secrets, not the secrets of shame or guilt, but the secrets of sacred knowledge that must be protected until the proper moment for revelation arrives. These are not secrets kept from others out of superiority or manipulation, but secrets held in trust for the collective unconscious, waiting for the right consciousness to emerge that can receive them without being damaged by them. In the end, spiritual awakening brings with it not just insight and freedom, but responsibility. The responsibility to carry knowledge wisely, to share truth skillfully, to love without attachment to outcomes, and to serve the evolution of consciousness not through force or persuasion, but through the patient embodiment of what you have discovered. This is the great work that falls to every awakening soul, to become a guardian of sacred knowledge, a protector of emerging consciousness, a silent servant of the self that seeks expression through human awareness. It is work that must often be done in solitude, in silence, in the depths of your own being, where the real transformation occurs. And perhaps this is the greatest secret of all, that the spiritual path is not about accumulating experiences or insights to share with others, but about becoming so completely yourself, so thoroughly individuated, so genuinely authentic, that your very presence becomes a question others begin to ask themselves about the possibility of their own awakening. The awakened person does not need to speak about their insights, because they have become their insights. They do not need to reveal their secrets, because they have become living expressions of the truths they have discovered. And in this becoming, in this complete integration of knowledge and being, they offer the greatest gift possible to a sleeping world, the example of what it means to be fully awake, fully human, fully alive. The awakened soul discovers something that may seem contradictory at first glance. The more deeply you understand yourself, the more you realize how little others truly wish to understand themselves. It is a curious phenomenon I have observed repeatedly. People will spend enormous energy avoiding the very self-knowledge that could set them free, while simultaneously demanding that others see them as they wish to be seen rather than as they actually are. This creates a peculiar burden for the person who has done the inner work. You find yourself in possession of a kind of sight that others actively resist. You can see the patterns that repeat themselves in their lives, the unconscious motivations that drive their choices, the shadow material they project onto everyone except themselves. And the temptation always is to believe that pointing out these patterns will be helpful, that showing someone their blind spots will lead to gratitude and growth. But I have learned, sometimes through painful experience, that consciousness cannot be imposed from without. It must emerge from within, like a plant growing toward light. When you attempt to force awareness upon someone who has not cultivated the soil of their own psyche, you are not planting seeds of wisdom. You are disturbing ground that is not yet ready to receive them. I remember a colleague who came to me years ago, troubled by what he perceived as his wife's excessive attachment to their grown children. He could see clearly how her inability to let them individuate was creating problems, not just for the children, but for their marriage. Everything he observed was accurate. The pattern was obvious to anyone who understood the psychology of family systems. But when he tried to share these insights with his wife, when he attempted to help her see what he saw so clearly, The result was not enlightenment, but explosion. She felt attacked, judged, reduced to a psychological case study. Their conversations became battles. Their intimacy suffered, and ironically, her grip on the children tightened rather than loosened. He had offered truth, but he had offered it to someone who experienced that truth as violence against her sense of self. This taught me something profound about the nature of psychological development. People must discover their own patterns in their own time and in their own way. The insights that seem so obvious to you, the connections that appear self-evident, may be completely invisible to others, not because they lack intelligence, but because their psyche is not yet structured in a way that can accommodate these truths. Think of it this way. When you tell someone they are living unconsciously, you are essentially asking them to question the very foundation upon which they have built their entire sense of identity. You are suggesting that their most cherished beliefs about themselves, their relationships, their life choices may be illusions. This is not information that can be received casually over afternoon tea. The unconscious mind has powerful defenses against such revelations. It will rationalize, project, deny, attack anything that threatens to expose the carefully constructed edifice of the ego. And the more accurate your perceptions, the more threatening they become. The person who sees clearly becomes not a helper but an enemy, not a friend but a danger to be neutralized or avoided. I have watched this dynamic play out countless times. The spiritually awakened person, filled with genuine love and desire to help, begins pointing out the unconscious patterns they observe in family members, friends, colleagues. They share their insights about shadow projection, about the difference between love and dependency, about the ways people avoid authentic relationship through various forms of psychological defense. And what happens? They find themselves increasingly isolated. People stop confiding in them, stop seeking their company, stop trusting them with intimate details of their lives. Not because they have been cruel or judgmental, but because their very presence has become a mirror that reflects back images others cannot bear to see. The paradox is exquisite. The more conscious you become, the more unconscious others appear to you. The clearer your vision becomes, the more others seem to live in fog. And yet, if you act upon this perception, if you attempt to dispel the fog for others, you often succeed only in making them cling more desperately to their obscurity. This is why the truly wise person learns to hold their insights lightly, to carry their awareness like water rather than like stone. They understand that their role is not to be a teacher unless they are explicitly asked to teach, not to be a healer unless healing is specifically requested, not to be a guide unless someone has genuinely lost their way and is seeking direction. Instead, they learn to embody their understanding rather than proclaim it. They become living examples of what integration looks like rather than lecturers about what others should integrate. Their presence becomes a question rather than an answer, an invitation rather than a demand. I have found that people are far more likely to begin questioning their own patterns when they encounter someone who has clearly done their own inner work than when they are told directly what that work should entail. There is something about authentic presence that speaks louder than any words, something about genuine self-knowledge that awakens curiosity in others about their own depths. But this requires tremendous patience and discipline. It means watching people you care about make choices you can see will bring them suffering. It means remaining silent when you could offer insights that might prevent certain kinds of pain. It means trusting that each soul has its own timing, its own curriculum, its own path toward consciousness. This does not mean you become passive or indifferent. There are times when intervention is necessary, when speaking truth becomes a moral imperative. But these moments are rarer than most awakened people believe. More often, the most loving thing you can do is to remain present without trying to fix, to listen without trying to solve, to witness without trying to change. I think of a patient I worked with many years ago, a woman who could see with remarkable clarity the dysfunctional patterns in her family of origin. She understood how her mother's anxiety had shaped her own relationship to intimacy, how her father's emotional unavailability had influenced her choice in partners, how the unspoken rules of her childhood home continued to govern her adult relationships. But when she tried to share these insights with her family, when she attempted to have conversations about these patterns during family gatherings, the result was chaos. Her mother became defensive and hurt. Her father withdrew even further. Her siblings accused her of being too analytical, too critical, too invested in blaming the past for present difficulties. It took her several years to understand that her insights, however accurate, were not gifts her family was ready to receive. She had to learn to carry her awareness privately, to use it for her own growth and healing without making it a burden for others to bear. She discovered that her understanding could transform her own responses to family dynamics without requiring her family to acknowledge or change those dynamics themselves. This is perhaps one of the most difficult lessons of spiritual awakening. Your consciousness is yours to develop and integrate. It is not a tool for analyzing or fixing others. It is not a weapon to be used against unconsciousness wherever you encounter it. It is not a torch you must carry to illuminate dark corners that others prefer to leave unexamined. Your awakening serves the collective not through direct intervention, but through the subtle influence of authentic presence. When you embody genuine self-knowledge, when you live from a place of integration rather than projection, when you respond to life from consciousness rather than reactivity, you create ripples that extend far beyond your immediate awareness. People sense something different about you, though they may not be able to articulate what it is. They feel safer in your presence because you are not trying to change them. They experience less judgment because you have learned to see human unconsciousness as a natural stage of development rather than a moral failing. They encounter in you a quality of being that suggests other possibilities without demanding that they explore those possibilities immediately. But here is what you must never reveal directly. You must never tell others that you see them as unconscious, that you understand their psychological patterns better than they do themselves, that you recognize the shadow material they are projecting or the defenses they are employing to avoid authentic relationship. Even if all of this is true, even if your perceptions are accurate and your intentions are loving, this kind of revelation rarely serves anyone's highest good. It creates shame where growth might have occurred naturally. It generates resistance where openness might have emerged gradually. It builds walls where bridges might have been constructed over time. The spiritually mature person learns to see without staring, to understand without explaining, to know without needing to demonstrate their knowledge. They develop what might be called a clinical compassion, the ability to perceive clearly while remaining emotionally detached from the need to act upon those perceptions. This does not mean becoming cold or indifferent. It means learning to love people exactly as they are, including their unconsciousness, their defenses, their resistance to growth. It means understanding that everyone is doing the best they can with the level of awareness they currently possess, and that pushing them to operate from a higher level before they are ready often produces regression rather than development. I have observed that the people who grow most quickly are those who feel accepted and understood in their current state. When someone feels judged or analyzed, when they sense that others see them as broken or unconscious or in need of fixing, they naturally become defensive. All their energy goes into protecting themselves rather than exploring themselves. But when someone encounters genuine acceptance, when they feel truly seen and appreciated for who they are right now, they often begin to relax their defenses. In that relaxation, curiosity can emerge, questions can arise, the natural desire for growth and understanding can surface without being forced or manipulated. This is why the awakened person must learn to guard not just their insights about others, but their judgments about unconsciousness itself. The moment you begin to see unconscious behavior as wrong or bad or inferior, you have lost your connection to the compassion that makes genuine service possible. You have forgotten that you too were once unconscious, that your own awakening was a gradual process that required patience and understanding from others. The path of consciousness is not a ladder that some people climb faster than others. It is more like a spiral staircase where everyone is at a different point, but everyone is moving upward in their own time and in their own way. Your job is not to pull people up to your level, but to continue your own ascent while remaining available to those who might benefit from your example. This availability must be offered without attachment to outcomes. You cannot invest your sense of worth or purpose in whether others choose to awaken. You cannot measure your spiritual development by your ability to influence or enlighten those around you. You cannot make other people's consciousness your project or your responsibility. Instead, you must learn to find satisfaction in your own growth, fulfillment in your own integration, meaning in your own relationship with the depths of the psyche. You become like a tree that grows toward the light, not to inspire other trees, but because growing toward light is simply what trees do. And yet, by growing authentically, by reaching genuinely toward your own highest potential, you create shade and shelter that others may find beneficial. The secret you must guard most carefully is the knowledge of how alone this path ultimately is. Not alone in the sense of isolated or abandoned, but alone in the sense that each person must do their own inner work. No one can develop consciousness for another person. No one can integrate someone else's shadow. No one can heal another's psychological wounds or solve another's existential dilemmas. This aloneness is not a tragedy to be overcome, but a fundamental aspect of human development. Each soul is on its own journey, following its own curriculum, learning its own lessons. Your awakening cannot shortcut another's process any more than your education can substitute for someone else's learning. When you fully accept this truth, when you stop trying to be responsible for other people's consciousness, a great burden lifts from your shoulders. You are free to focus on your own development, your own integration, your own relationship with the self. And paradoxically, it is often when you stop trying to awaken others that you become most helpful to those who are genuinely ready to awaken themselves. The spiritually awakened person becomes a living question mark in a world full of false certainties, not by challenging others directly, but by embodying a different way of being that suggests other possibilities. They demonstrate what it looks like to live from authenticity rather than persona, from consciousness rather than reactivity, from love rather than fear. And sometimes, just sometimes, someone notices, someone begins to wonder what it would be like to live with such integrity, such presence, such genuine self-knowledge. Someone starts to ask the questions that lead to their own awakening. And in that moment, the awakened person's true service is revealed, not as a teacher or healer or guide, but as a reminder of what human consciousness can become when it is allowed to develop naturally, patiently, in its own perfect time. This understanding brings us to something even more delicate, something I have wrestled with in the darkest hours of my own journey. You see, when you begin to perceive the archetypal forces that move through human life like invisible rivers beneath the surface of consciousness, when you recognize these eternal patterns playing themselves out in every relationship, every conflict, every moment of crisis and transformation, you face a temptation that is almost irresistible. You begin to see your own life not as a series of random events or personal choices, but as a carefully orchestrated drama written by forces far greater than your conscious mind. You recognize the moments when you were possessed by the archetype of the wounded healer, driven to help others while avoiding your own deepest pain. You see the times when the shadow of the wise old man took hold of you, making you rigid and judgmental in your certainty. You understand how the anima has led you through projections and infatuations that had nothing to do with the actual women in your life and everything to do with your own unintegrated feminine nature. This recognition can be profoundly liberating because it means your mistakes were not merely personal failures but necessary encounters with archetypal energies that every human being must eventually face. Your suffering takes on cosmic significance when you realize it connects you to the eternal human drama of individuation, of becoming who you truly are. But here lies a danger that I must warn you about with the utmost seriousness. The moment you begin to speak of these patterns to others, the moment you start pointing out the archetypal forces operating in their lives, you risk committing a kind of psychological violence that is far more harmful than you might imagine. I learned this lesson through a mistake I made many years ago with a young man who came to me in great distress. He was caught in a pattern of falling desperately in love with women who remained forever out of reach, unavailable either because they were married or because they simply could not return the intensity of his feelings. The pattern was so clear to me, so obviously a classic case of anima projection, that I felt compelled to explain it to him. I told him with what I thought was great compassion and insight that he was not really in love with these women at all. I explained that he was projecting his own unconscious feminine nature onto them, that his passion was really a longing for wholeness within himself, that once he integrated this projected material, he would be free to love real women rather than his own inner images. Everything I said was psychologically accurate. The analysis was correct, the interpretation sound, but what I witnessed in that moment was devastating. I watched as the light went out of his eyes, as something vital and precious died within him. His romantic feelings, which had been the most intense and meaningful experiences of his life, suddenly became nothing more than psychological symptoms. His capacity for passionate love, which had connected him to something transcendent and eternal, was reduced to a technical problem to be solved. I had given him knowledge, yes, but I had taken away his mystery. I had explained his experience, but I had also explained it away. In my eagerness to help him understand the archetypal dimension of his romantic life, I had inadvertently severed his connection to the very forces that give life meaning and depth. This taught me something that no textbook could have conveyed. Archetypal knowledge is sacred knowledge. It is not meant to be used as a tool for analysis or interpretation, but as a way of understanding the deeper currents that move through all human experience. When you reduce someone's most profound experiences to archetypal patterns, when you explain their deepest feelings as projections or possessions, you are not enlightening them. You are performing a kind of psychological surgery without anesthesia. cutting away the very connections that give their inner life its vitality and significance. The truth is that we need our projections, at least for a time. We need to be possessed by archetypal forces before we can learn to relate to them consciously. The young man's anima projections were not obstacles to be overcome, but necessary stages in his psychological development. Through his passionate, impossible loves, he was learning something essential about the nature of the feminine, about the depths of his own capacity for feeling, about the relationship between longing and transcendence. By explaining this process to him before he had lived it fully, before he had extracted from it all the meaning it contained, I had interrupted a natural development that needed to unfold in its own time and in its own way. I had imposed my understanding upon his experience, rather than allowing his experience to gradually give birth to its own understanding. This is why you must guard your archetypal insights with such careful discretion, not because they are false or harmful in themselves, but because they are powerful medicines that can become poisons when administered at the wrong time or in the wrong dosage. The person who is living through an archetypal possession needs to inhabit that experience fully before they can step back and see it objectively. Think of it this way: when someone is deeply in love, when they are experiencing that magnificent obsession that transforms their entire world, they are in contact with one of the most powerful forces in human psychology. To tell them in that moment that their feelings are just projection is like telling someone in the middle of a religious experience that they are just hallucinating. Even if there is some truth to the interpretation, the timing makes it destructive rather than helpful. The archetypal dimension of human experience must be discovered from within, not imposed from without. People must come to recognize these patterns through their own lived experience, through their own reflection, through their own gradual awakening to the deeper forces that shape their lives. Your role is not to be an interpreter of these forces for others, but to have wrestled with them so completely in your own life that your presence becomes a kind of invitation for others to begin their own wrestling. And so we come to the heart of this great mystery, this paradox of awakening that every conscious soul must eventually face. You have been given eyes to see what others cannot see, ears to hear what others cannot hear, a heart that recognizes truths others are not yet ready to embrace. This is both your gift and your burden, your treasure and your cross. But remember this above all else: your awakening is not a weapon to be wielded against the unconsciousness of others. It is not a torch to be thrust into faces that prefer the gentle darkness of their necessary illusions. It is not a key you must use to unlock doors that others have chosen to keep closed. Your consciousness is a seed that must first take root in the soil of your own being before it can ever hope to flower in the garden of human community. The 5 secrets I have shared with you today, these aspects of your spiritual awakening that you must guard so carefully, they are not burdens to be carried alone forever. They are treasures to be held in trust, sacred knowledge that awaits the proper moment, the right consciousness, the prepared heart that can receive them without being wounded by their weight. In time, if you are patient, if you are wise, if you learn to embody rather than proclaim what you have discovered, you will find others who can see as you see, who can hear as you hear, who can walk beside you in this strange territory between sleeping and waking. And then, in the safety of that recognition, in the sanctuary of that understanding, these secrets can finally be shared as they were meant to be shared, not as revelations forced upon the unwilling, but as confirmations offered to the awakened. Until then, carry your insights like a mother carries her unborn child, with reverence, with protection, with infinite patience for the natural timing of their emergence into the world.